Thanks for coming out this evening. My name is Randy Yu. I'm the curator of modern political and historical collections at the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library. And I am co-curator of the exhibition out there, Bobby Jones, The Game of Life, with Kristen Morgan, who's hiding back there in the back. She's the co-curator. There she is. Thank you for coming out tonight. I want to welcome you on behalf of Rich Mendola, the Senior Vice Provost for Libraries and Digital Scholarship, Yolanda Cooper, the University Librarian, and Rosemary McGee, the Director of the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library. We have a new name just as of today, so I'm trying to say it properly just because I haven't practiced it much. Thanks for coming out. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar faces. Welcome to this year's Bobby Jones Scholars. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Welcome to our good friends from Friends of Bobby Jones Golf Course. Thanks y'all for coming out tonight. If this is y'all's first time here, welcome. I have a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We have cards in the back for you to fill out so that we can keep you informed about other library events that you might be interested in. We also, on back, welcome your comments about how fabulous tonight's event was. Also, you will find in the back a schedule of our fall events, including in this room on Saturday. There is a panel discussion about our History Tour app on Saturday. Now, if you would please, silence or turn off your devices so our digital overlords will not interrupt the proceedings this evening. Now, tonight's event is held in conjunction with the exhibition in the Shatton Gallery, Bobby Jones, The Game of Life. If you walk out into this corridor and go to the rotunda, you will see that we begin the exhibit with the present, not with the past. This was a very conscious decision on our part. We begin with the Robert T. Jones Jr. Scholarship Program. And we did that because we wanted to draw a direct connection between Bobby Jones's achievements on the golf course, his achievements in the game of life, and Mr. Jones's legacy here at Emory University. Do y'all know what Mr. Jones's connection to Emory University is? You can't answer. Well, Mr. Woodruff was a good friend. He went to law school here. Did he graduate from law school? No, he didn't. He came here to come to law school, and after 3 quarters, he took the bar exam to see how difficult it was, and he passed. So there's no reason to come back. So one of the things we wanted to do was focus on this connection with today. So whether you're talking about the Bobby Jones Scholars, our partnership with the University of St. Andrews, whether you're talking about the Laney Graduate School's Jones Program in Ethics, or the Biomedical Engineering Fellowship, or whether you're talking about the Bobby Jones Collection, or the Sidney L. Matthew Bobby Jones Collection, which we have in the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library, these are direct, vibrant, strong legacies that are still with us today. Now, tonight's event continues with that theme, tying together the past and the present. Our guest this evening, Dr. Bob Jones, is the grandson of Bobby Jones. Bob Jones, we are delighted to have him here. He is a licensed psychologist in private practice, specializing in clinical psychology, sports psychology, and executive coaching. He is a recognized public speaker in each of these areas, as well as an expert on his grandfather's life. He has been interviewed by just about every major media outlet in America. And having written several articles and several forewords to books about Bobby Jones, he is now working on a psychological biography of his grandfather. Mr. Jones is no stranger to Emory. He serves on the Robert T. Jones Jr. Memorial Scholarship Committee. He's also on the Board of Trustees for the Chiara and Syringomyelia Foundation, and also, I'm going to forget this, an advisory committee for the historic Oakland Cemetery. Bob is a member of his grandfather's home club, the Atlanta Athletic Club, and also a member of Sage Valley Golf Club in Grandville, South Carolina. It is our pleasure this evening to have Dr. Bob Jones. Would y'all please welcome him?
That's good memory.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. It is so great to be with you all tonight. I'm not used to hearing my own voice with an echo, so this is kind of good. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about my grandfather because as we've gone on in time, I think sometimes it's easy to forget what the contribution of Bobby Jones really has been to the game of golf. And I'm just going to state it very, very simply. Bobby Jones was the pivotal figure in the game of golf in the entire 20th century. Everything that we know in the game of golf is defined by what it was before Bobby Jones and what it was after Bobby Jones. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that. The first one is very simply this. Golf celebrates 4 major championships every single year. 4 major championships. Now, why is that? It's because Bobby Jones won 4 major championships. The highest achievement that can be made in the entire game of golf is the Grand Slam of golf. That is the winning of all 4 major championships in 1 calendar year. To date, there is only one person in history that has ever accomplished that deed, and that was my grandfather, Robert Tyre Jones, Jr., in 1930. When the pros decided they needed a Grand Slam, it took a little bit of work, and Arnold Palmer set, I believe it was Bob Drum, out to determine what would be a professional Grand Slam that would be the equivalent. And so since professionals couldn't play in the amateur championships that my grandfather played in, they had to get 2 that they could play in. And so they picked one of them, logically, was the PGA Championship, which is, of course, the last of the majors each year, of the pro majors. But the first one they picked was the Masters Tournament, which was also founded by my grandfather. We think, in fact, another area where he affected the game of golf is even in golf course design. We think of Augusta National as a very traditional design now. And what we don't realize was that when Augusta National was opened in the early 1930s, and when the Masters was first played in 1934, the design of the Augusta National Golf Club was absolutely radical for its day. It was a golf course of very wide fairways, very, very little bunkering, greens that were diabolically severe, as they still are, but there was none of the, for example, there was none of the drama that you would find at a place like Oakmont, of course, where Oakmont has more bunkers than Carter has liver pills, I think. And on their bunkers, in fact, at Oakmont, they used to have rakes that had furrows like this, so your ball was destined to go down into the bottom of a furrow. It is such a punitive system of bunkering that Oakmont isn't even allowed to use those rakes when they host a USGA championship. But they do use them outside of that. Oakmont also does one other thing. When they have national championships, they slow their greens down. So if you want to get a sense of that, go find a terrazzo floor and putt on it, and that's kind of what it's like. But Augusta National was a horse of a totally different color. And in those early days especially, before the crowds were where they are now, you can see these panoramic vista that presented itself to the golfer, and that was something totally different in American golf at the time. And that was something that was done from the mind of my grandfather. Another thing that he did, everybody always says to me, I wonder what would your grandfather think about the equipment that is used in the game now. I'll tell you what he'd think. He probably would have been for it if it helped the average golfer. When he played with hickory shafts. Now, I want to tell you something about hickory shafts. You can't, it's often said that he never practiced very much, and that's true, he never did. The reason he didn't was because if you hit too many shots with a hickory shaft, they would lose their playability and you'd have to change out the shaft. And since the shaft of the golf club is so important to the feel, he couldn't practice too terribly much with them because he just didn't want to have to constantly reshaft the golf clubs. The other thing about hickory is that it's important to remember that hickory is wood. Yes, I know, you figured that part out already. But here's the thing about wood. Wood changes its playability with the weather, okay? So if you're going out in the summertime and you've got hickory shafts and it's 95 degrees in Atlanta with 70% humidity like it is most of the summers, then your shaft is going to have a lot more flexibility and a lot more torque to it than if you're going out when it's 35 degrees. So you can imagine what the variance in playability was when he would play in like British Open championships. So when he finished his competitive life, he decided that what he wanted to do is he wanted to make the game more manageable for the average player. So he went to A.G. Spalding and Company and he designed a set of irons with steel shafts in them. And he did that so that he could make a set of clubs that matched from the driver all the way down to the wedge. He wanted it to be more playable and more forgiving for the average player. As he used to like to say, golf is just too difficult a game without having to fight against your equipment all the time. And so that's why he did it. The problem was nobody wanted to buy a steel-shafted golf club because Bobby Jones used wooden-shafted golf clubs. So he was in this kind of a puzzle. So how did they came up with an ideal solution, and that was they painted the shafts yellow. And then they sold like hotcakes. And they were Spalding's leading club for probably the next 45 years. It was an incredible run with the Bobby Jones Crowflight. And in addition to that, he was very, very concerned about the development of the game of golf. He particularly took a lot of interest in the development of junior golf. And he also was very instrumental in the development of women's golf. It was not uncommon for fine women players to be invited to Augusta National to play. And the late Louise Suggs actually wrote about the experience she had about how Augusta National, because of my grandfather's influence, was foundational in the establishment of the LPGA. He was an honorary member, I think, of the LPGA, also of the PGA of America, and served on the executive committee of the USGA. Now, I say all this to let you know that his interests were much broader than just simply playing golf. But playing golf was something he did very well too. And I realize there's some fairly young folks here, and you may not realize exactly what his competitive record was. He played in his first tournament, first national championship, in 1916 when he was 14 years old. He went up to play in the United States Amateur at the Marion Cricket Club in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. And while he was at Marion in the qualifying rounds, he went out and led the entire field in the first round of qualifying. He kind of blew up in the afternoon round, but he qualified very comfortably. And in that tournament at 14 years old, he went to the third round of match play before he was finally defeated by Robert A. Gardner, who was the man who eventually went on to win the tournament. And what nobody knew at the time was that a streak was started in that tournament that I'm not so sure has ever really been quite equaled, and that was this. From 1914 until the time he retired in 1930, nobody ever beat, from 1916 to 1930, nobody ever beat him in match play twice. In his entire career, nobody ever beat him in match play twice. He played in some national events all the way up until about 1923 without winning any. And it was to the point where he really was starting to question whether or not that was going to happen. He broke through in 1923 and won the U.S. Open at Inwood in Long Island. And from the time of 1923 to 1930, he won 4 United States Opens. He lost 2 in a playoff, by the way. He finished second 4 times in the United States Open. But he won 4 United States Opens, 5 United States Amateurs, 3 British Opens, and 1 British Amateur. He won all 4 of the national championships, the British Amateur, the British Open, the United States Open, and the United States Amateur in 1930, and then he retired, having no more worlds left to conquer. We call that the Grand Slam now. Back when it was done, do you know what they called it? They didn't have a name for it. It had never been done before. Nobody even knew what to call it. He had never talked about it, even with O.B. Keeler, the sports writer from the Atlanta Journal that used to accompany him to all his tournaments. Nobody had ever talked about it. O.B. Keeler came up with this wonderful title for it. He called it the Impregnable Quadrilateral. And as you can tell, that doesn't exactly drip off the tongue. So that didn't really stand. O.B., though, had a flair for the poetic. O.B. had a flair for a lot of things, actually. In fact, there is one story that is told of O.B. spending an evening with someone who was maybe not, shall we say, his wife. And the next morning, she said to him, she said, O.B., she said, you said you were going to write me a poem. And O.B. just kind of looked funny, grabbed his typewriter, and he typed out something along the lines of, my typewriter's most ambitious to secure your lasting fame, but the liquor we had was vicious, and I cannot recall your name. It's amazing that he never had a serious head injury after something like that, but my grandfather always wanted, when he retired, his fantasy was always to be able to just come back to Atlanta and play golf with his friends. It was a fantasy that I think he always kept, as we all do. You know, we all have these sort of ideals of what we want to achieve. But he never was able to achieve that one because his force of personality, his mental ability, the quality with which he lived his life was so strong that he was constantly almost compelled to make contribution after contribution, not just to the game of golf, but also to the city where he lived, also to the United States when it was embroiled in World War II, and he could have received a medical deferment because of varicose veins, but instead went into the Army and landed on Normandy on D-Day +1, still under fire. So he never was able to just settle back into that life that he dreamed of, where he used to love to have poems recited, and he would always say when he was retired that what he would do is he would have a cabin in the Highlands where the men who were boys when he was a boy would sit and drink with him. A bucolic image that just never quite made it into his life. But his life is what is really interesting. And that's what I kind of want to talk with you about tonight, is how he came to be the man that he was. And to do that, we're going to talk about a few different people than normally are spoken about in talking about my grandfather's life. If you read much of his writings, you will often see that he had a tremendously close relationship with his own father. And in fact, they did. They used to have adjoining offices together on the 14th floor of the CNS building in Marietta Street in downtown Atlanta. And when I say an adjoining office, I don't mean it was like right next to each other. I mean, they had a sliding door between the two offices so that they could come and go into each other's office without anyone having to necessarily know what it was that they were about. But my grandfather was really formed in many ways by someone quite different, and that was by his mother, my great grandmother. Clara Merrick Thomas was her name. Granny is what we called her. Granny stood, well, actually I never saw Granny stand because she was pretty well bedridden, but To the best of my understanding, Granny used to say she was 4 feet 11. And, you know, when people who are like at that height say they're 4 feet 11, it really means they're a little shorter than that. But Granny had absolutely riveting, piercing eyes. She was a fiercely bright, fiercely competitive person. And she was probably one of the most intellectually curious people that you would ever know. She and my great-grandfather married and lived up in Canton, Georgia, and she became pregnant in 1900 with what would be their first son. And it was a difficult pregnancy for her, and when she finally delivered him, it was a little boy. His name was Bailey, and William Bailey Jones was his name. He was born on March the 17th of 1901. March the 17th of 1901. He was a sickly child from the very beginning, and she was bound and determined that he was going to survive. But he never could get sufficient nourishment. He never could really develop. And as spring wore into summer, things did not look good for Bailey. And finally, in July of 1901, little Bailey died. It was devastating for Granny, absolutely devastating, because she had struggled so hard to make it, to have this child make it, and to have him just die because he could not thrive was almost more than she could bear. As I said, Granny was a pretty fiercely competitive person, and she, from that day on, would never refer to him by his name. She would simply call him the baby that died. Bailey is buried in the Jones family cemetery under the 10-foot-high headstone that marks the grave of Robert Tyre Jones, the first, the original. It's just a small little headstone that just simply says Bailey, March the 17th, 1901 to, I believe, July, sometime late July of 1901. By the time Bailey died, though, my great-grandmother was pregnant again. And I don't think it takes too much of a psychoanalyst to understand the anxiety that that produced in her. Because here she was now, pregnant again with another child. What she didn't exactly know, although she was smart enough, she could add 9 months to the calendar, was that her next child would be born at about the same time as the baby that died. So what she did was, she said to my great-grandfather, she absolutely insisted that the family needed to move to Atlanta because she needed to make sure that there was the best medical care that she could possibly get. She blamed a lot of the fact that Bailey died on the medical care that was available in Canton at the time. And she was a little bit harsh on physicians. After all, her father was a physician in Auburn, Alabama. And so she and my great-grandfather moved to Atlanta. He established a law practice in Atlanta. And 1 year to the day after the birth of William Bailey Jones, on March the 17th, 1902, Robert Tyre Jones, Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, you may rest assured that Granny, if she was ferociously competitive about keeping Bailey alive, she was going to make sure that little Rob, as they called him, would have a real fighting chance at survival. But it was touch and go for a long time. My grandfather was very small as a baby. I don't know the exact birth weight, but I know it was under 6 pounds. He was not able to take solid food until he was 5 years old, having to eat mostly pablum during that time, which is just kind of like, well, think of it like porridge without any flavor to it. That was about all he could really hold. Well, that's kind of redundant, isn't it? At any rate, but that was all he could hold down. Now, the other thing about it was, he was pretty much homebound during that whole time. She was not going to let him out of her sight. And until he was about 4.5 or 5 years old, he did not get out of the house. Now, I found out something very interesting about Granny that nobody's ever really talked about, written about, because really nobody's ever known it. So now you guys are going to be, and all of you on YouTube are going to be the first to know this. My great-grandmother was very intellectually curious. And it was very important to her that she transmit that to her son. So there were always books to read, and even as a young boy, he learned how to read very, very young. Well, when you're alone in the house a lot, you don't have too much else to do. The other thing that she did was she encouraged him to explore what narrow an environment he had. And here's how I found this out. I was talking to my sister, Mimi. It gets real fun in our house, because I have a wife, Mimi, and a sister, Mimi. We won't even go there. But at any rate, I was talking to my sister, Mimi, and I said, what do you remember about Granny? And she said, well, the thing I remember the most, when we would go to Granny's house, because my sister's a few years older than me, so when we would go to Granny's house, what she would always do was she would have her maid hide Hershey bars throughout the house. And she would encourage us to go find them. And they would just be in the most exotic places you could ever imagine, where these things would be hidden. And I heard that, and it was like a light bulb went off in my head. Because here is a person that, even with the limitation that she had of being bedridden, was bound and determined that she was going to make sure that little children had their intellectual curiosity, their need to explore their environment, that they had that satisfied. The other thing that she would do is she would ask them questions. And they would have to go and find a book. Maybe it's in an encyclopedia, or maybe it's in a book of poetry. And if they found what she was looking for, they would get another candy bar. It's amazing that we're not all diabetics, but you see what it does, it tells us something about what that life for my grandfather was like. And what he got from her was an ability to become very, very focused on things that he wanted to accomplish. He developed a very strong sense of intellectual curiosity and a very broad sense of intellectual curiosity. Remember that he later went on to have 3 degrees, well, 2 degrees really, one in mechanical engineering, one in English literature, and then of course he didn't get a law degree. Just between us, I was invited by Emory to receive the award on behalf of my grandfather when he was named the Law School Student of the Year. And I remember standing up to receive the award and talking about how proud my grandfather was of Emory and his association with the university. And I said, however, today, of course, marks an extremely historic occasion in that I believe this is the first time in the history of the Emory University Law School that its Distinguished Alumnus Award has gone to a law school dropout. They didn't laugh like you did. It was like deadpan. And I found out that I was being sued the next morning. It was incredible. But he was a man of intense intellectual curiosity and also tremendous focus. And that would come very strongly into play later on. He really wasn't a wizard at golf. At the beginning anyway. His favorite game was baseball. He used to love to play baseball, and he particularly enjoyed playing catcher until someone foul-tipped a ball and it almost belted him in the head. And after that, he realized that, no, he was probably better served in the outfield. And when he was just a very small lad, probably about 5 years old, my great-grandfather, Robert Permetus Jones, who was known as the Colonel, he thought it would be a fantastic idea to move the family out to the country to a new golf course called East Lake, which was out in the middle of nowhere in 1904. Now, of course, we call it downtown. East Lake was brand new, and a very interesting thing happened that was so fortuitous that nobody could have ever really seen what impact this would have on the game of golf. East Lake hired a man named Stuart Maiden to become their golf professional. Now, Stuart Maiden was just this very dour old Scot. You could barely understand a single word he said through his brogue. But what he had was unbelievable, and that was this. He had what was called a Carnoustie golf swing, a Carnoustie swing. Now, there were basically at that time two types of golf swings. There was a St. Andrew's swing, most known by a guy named Harry Vardon. Harry Vardon was considered to be one of the most accurate players in the history of golf. They said if he played a 36-hole match, he was always at a disadvantage in the second round because he would have to play the second round out of his divots from the first round. So, and the St. Andrew's swing was, me doing golf, I mean, you're about to find out that the gene pool does dilute over time. The St. Andrew's swing worked around the body this way. It was very rotational, all right? The Carnoustie swing was rotational also, but it was rotational very upright, very upright. And that was the swing that Stuart Maiden had. Now, a lot of people thought that my grandfather took lessons from Stuart. That's actually not true. My grandfather never took a single lesson from Stuart Maiden in his entire life. I mean, he got a couple of tips from him, but no formal lesson. What he did do was he learned how to mimic Stuart's swing. And he did that with such perfection that by the time he was 10 years old, people would see him across the East Lake course and think they were looking at Stuart. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. At 6 years old, he played in his very, very first tournament. And his very first tournament was put together by Mrs. Frank Metter. Mrs. Metter owned the boarding house where the family lived during the summertime. And she set this tournament up. It was a 6-hole match between my grandfather, Perry Adair, Frank Metter, her son, and Alexa Sterling. Alexa Sterling is often forgotten, but Alexa Sterling actually ended up probably being one of the finest women golfers in the history of the game. She won later on, of course, she won 3 National Women's Amateur Championships at the time when that would be the equivalent of the Women's Open today. Now, they played a 6-hole tournament on East Lake. My grandfather said, oh, he felt like he was such a big boy because all the matches on the golf course would give way to the tournament coming through. And when the tournament was finished, they all handed in their scorecards. Mrs. Metter calculated up the scores and determined that my grandfather had won. And the trophy was a little cup, a little silver cup about that big. And she presented him with that cup, and he said, when he wrote Down the Fairway in 1927, he said, by that time in his life he had over 100 cups, but that little silver cup, which is on display to this day at the Atlanta Athletic Club, that little cup was the only cup that he had ever slept with. And even when he had finished his career and he had this beautiful oriental case wherein he kept all of his medals, on top of that case was a replica of the British Amateur Trophy that had been sent to him by his fellow members of the Royal and Ancient Golf Club, and the silver cup from that tournament that he won when he was just a wee lad. Now, the interesting part of that, I said to you that Granny was competitive, and that's where my grandfather got that from. The interesting part of that tournament is this. My grandfather went to his grave believing that Alexa Sterling had actually won that trophy, but that Mrs. Metter was not going to give the trophy to a girl. How about that? You know what the most amazing thing is? He believed that to his dying day. And he didn't give it to her either. He had a very strong competitive streak. Now, he played golf mainly for fun. He broke 80 for the first time when he was 10 years old. I think Tiger Woods did that when he was about 5, but But Tiger didn't do it with hickory-shafted clubs and a ball that was about the compression of a ping-pong ball. There was a picture of him winning the Druid Hills Club Championship when he was 10 years old. You'll see it out there playing against Archer Davidson, wasn't it? And there's a love, when you go, don't just look at my grandfather's picture when you see that picture out there. Take a look at the face of Mr. Davidson. Look how happy he is to have been defeated by a little boy who was about this big. It really is, it's a classic picture, and one that I think kind of summarizes where my grandfather was coming from. In 1916, he won the first Georgia State Amateur Championship when it was held at Brookhaven. And George Adair, Perry's father, Perry was the real Dixie whiz kid at the time, thought it would be a great idea for my grandfather to accompany Perry to Philadelphia for the National Amateur. And since my grandfather had just won the state amateur, that was a great idea to him as well. So off they went on the train to Philadelphia. I mentioned that Bub, we called my grandfather Bub, so if I refer to him as Bub, that's who I'm talking about. I've mentioned that he led the first round of qualifying. That was also including a double bogey. This was on the West course at Marion. Remember, he had never played greens as fast as Marion before. And he got on one hole, I think it's the 6th hole, it's par 3 at Marion. There's a creek in front of the green. He had a 30-foot putt from behind the hole, and he kind of lost the sense of where he was at the time, and he played the 30-foot putt on the Marion green like he would have played it on East Lake's green. He gave it a big whack and knocked it through the green into the water, had to go around to the other side, drop it, take a penalty, and pitch it back up. And even including that, he still led the field. When he played in the first round, he played against a man who was a former champion of the U.S. Amateur named Eben Byers. Now, this is where something very important in my grandfather's life came into play. Eben Byers was a notorious club thrower, and that was just fine with my grandfather because he was a club thrower as well. O.B. Keeler used to say that he had the face of an angel and the temper of a timber wolf, and that's probably true. Byers and my grandfather just threw club after club, and finally, when my grandfather beat Byers by something like 1 or 2 up, when they asked him, well, how did you manage to beat Eben Byers? My grandfather said, well, he ran out of clubs before I did. He went on, as I said, to get to the 3rd round when he finally lost to Robert Gardner. And at that point, his temper became probably one of the most defining things about him. More people knew him for his temper than for his ability on the golf course. Now, the thing that's important to understand about his temper is this. He is often written up as though he was some sort of just like petulant little child. But that's not the kind of temper he had. What he had was what we would call in psychology rage. He had a very strong perfectionistic streak, and he would absolutely go into blinding rages when shots would not come out the way he had envisioned them coming out. And this was to have been a hallmark of his throughout the next 7 or 8 years of his competitive life. And it just got so bad that at one point he went overseas to the British Open for the first time in 1921. He was 19 years old. He was playing fairly well, and he went out to play in the 3rd round of the championship, and he got out to the par 3 11th hole, put his ball in the bunker, and after leaving the ball in the bunker a few times, he tore up his scorecard and withdrew from the championship. Now, contrary to myth, he did not storm off the golf course. He continued to stay on the golf course and play in the tournament, even though he was mainly at that point just playing as a marker. But he did withdraw from the championship. And Bernard Darwin, the great golf writer, was so scandalized by the fact that my grandfather withdrew that he wrote in, I believe, the London Times the next day that Master Bobby Jones is just a boy, and a very ordinary boy at that. And it really stung him. But I'll tell you what stung him more. He went on to play that final round, and he realized that had he finished that tournament, he would have tied for third place. And he learned something from that. What he learned was that in golf, everything always evens out. And that was a very important lesson for him. You might think that he took that lesson and learned, never withdraw, never throw a club, keep your cool, keep calm. I'd love to say that's the case, but it wasn't. He continued to be a notorious club thrower, and that continued into 1922 when he was playing in, I believe, the United States Open. And in that tournament, he had always believed that throwing clubs never hurt anybody. It just hurt him. So what was the big deal? Well, he'd hit a particularly horrendous shot, and he threw his club, and it bounced off the ground, and the head of his club hit a woman in the shin and busted her shin open. And that was the first time it ever occurred to him that, oh my gosh, there really are consequences to my actions that go far beyond, far beyond what I do on the golf course. Well, the consequences weren't too long in following. He got home and there was a letter that came from New York City not too long after, and it was from George Herbert Walker. George Herbert Walker was the maternal grandfather of George Herbert Walker Bush. He was president of the United States Golf Association. And he had sent to my grandfather a letter that stated that unless and until he learned to control his temper, he needed to understand that there was a very strong chance that his applications to United States Golf Association tournaments would not be accepted. He learned from that, and he went to play in the he went on to play in the amateur that year. And he'd sent Walker a letter back stating that from then on his behavior would always be exemplary. In 1923, he broke through to win the U.S. Open at Inwood, and many people commented that it was a very different Bobby Jones. It was a much calmer Bobby Jones. It was someone who was extraordinarily polite, very even. At that point, you could never tell if he'd just made birdie or double bogey because he stayed very even. And that was the way he played the remainder of his competitive life from 1923 until 1930. Now the question is, how does somebody who has that kind of rage go from having that strong emotion to being able to contain it as effectively as he did? And part of that was because of the strength of his own mind, the strength of his mind. And one of the things that anybody who plays athletics at that kind of level, they have to do, is they have to learn how to function in an area of functioning. We would call it, like you see it now, playing in the zone. They have to learn how to function at a level where they are just stimulated enough to where they are effective, but not so excited that they can't control what they want their body to do. In other words, there is a range of functioning that an athlete has to get into in order to function at a top level. And that is what he did. But he did it without the help that we would have today with sports psychologists. He did that even without Zen masters. He did that without a number of folks. But he did it in a very specific way. The first thing he did was he became convinced mentally something about golf tournaments. And he believed this very strongly. He believed that a golf tournament was won or lost before the first ball had ever even been struck in the tournament. He believed that the destiny of a golf tournament was set long before the first ball was ever struck. Now that sounds kind of strange to us, but when you look at his family background, you could see where he got that. He got that little tidbit from his grandfather, Robert Tyre Jones. Robert Tyre Jones was a barrel of a man. He was about 6'5", weighed about 220 pounds. He lived up in Canton. And before he became a Baptist as a young man, he was a very devout Presbyterian. And he believed very strongly in predestination, that things were ordained from the beginning of time. My grandfather borrowed that idea and applied it to golf. And he used to say, he said, look at how many times you would see a player get out there who might have otherwise won a tournament, but he had 2 putts lip out. That just has to be ordained from the beginning. Now, so what this does is it allows him to separate himself out from the anxiety of the golf match itself, and it allows him to have a little bit of a healthy distance from it so that he's not quite so emotionally enmeshed into the event. That was one of the things that he did. The other thing that he learned very, very quickly, and he learned this from his mother, and that was this. In order to be successful in golf, you have to focus simply on one shot at a time. You cannot allow your mind to drift to the things which are going to come ahead of you or to be stuck on the things that have come behind you. You have to simply focus on the one shot that you have at the time. And he became so good at that there were shots that he would hit in competition where he would have absolutely no recollection of having hit the shot. Now let me tell you what that means. What that means is this. He is so focused on the present that he was not taking his experience and even going to the mental effort to put it into his short-term memory so that it could later be stored in long-term recall. That is an unbelievable level of focus. In fact, he described many occasions where he remembered standing over the ball and he remembered seeing the ball in flight but had no recollection of the actual shot that he had struck. So what he did was he learned then how to stay focused in the present. And the final thing that he did, that he wrote about, was that he learned how to compete against old man par. Old man par. Because in the days when he played, unlike now where they shoot 25 under, in the days when he played, if you shot par, you stood a pretty good chance of winning the tournament. And so he would never concern himself with what anybody around him was playing. He would just focus on what's the par for the course. That's what I want to shoot. And that's what he did. Now, I want you to think about those 3 things. Those are all extremely present-focused items. And that's what allowed him, that and his phenomenal hand-eye coordination, that allowed him to be such a great golfer. But it did more. It did more. Because you see, golf is a funny thing. Golf, probably more than most other games, more closely mirrors life than just about any other game. In a round of golf, you can, my grandfather said, a round of golf, you can be everything from from the hero of a side-splitting comedy to the dogged victim of inexorable fate. All in the course of 4 hours without having to repair a tangled personality or bury a corpse, as he said. But it's a metaphor, in many ways it's a metaphor for life. And in his case, it turned out to be so much more than he even realized. Bobby Jones played in many golf tournaments. But the greatest golf tournament he played in, or the greatest tournament he played in, had nothing to do with golf, even though it started on a golf course. In 1929, he was out playing a round of golf with some friends and his father at East Lake when one of those freaky storms came up out of nowhere. Anybody that's been in Atlanta longer than one summer has seen many of these storms that start out as like little clouds off in the distance, and then the next thing you know, this cloud is turned into this monstrous thunderhead. They were on East Lake. They were on the 12th hole at East Lake, and the 12th hole's kind of coming back towards the clubhouse, and all of a sudden a bolt of lightning hit on the 10th fairway, maybe 150 yards from where they were standing. The men and the caddies all took off toward the clubhouse, and right when they were just about to get to the safety of the clubhouse, another bolt of lightning ripped into the chimney of the East Lake clubhouse, shattering it and sending down bricks and rocks, one of which cut through my grandfather's umbrella, struck him a glancing blow on the neck, and knocked him to the ground, almost ripping his shirt off. while he was lying there for it took the people he was playing with a couple of minutes to figure out what had happened, and at that point they were concerned that he might be dead. And instead, in about a couple of minutes, he got up and he shook it all off, and he got up and he's like, "Well, boys, we sure dodged a bullet on that one, didn't we?" Well, there are bullets, and then there are bullets. This is in 1929. He was the U.S. Open champion for the third time at this point. But what he really wasn't aware of at that time was the greatest match that he was ever going to have had started with that lightning bolt. Because what he didn't know was that inside his spinal column, there was an injury that had occurred that was going to allow a sliver, like a finger of fluid, to develop and expand and start very, very slowly and inexorably to press against the spinal cord in a disease that is now known as syringomyelia, and that it was going to start from that point on. And there was nothing that could be done about it. There was nothing to treat it. But he didn't know this. He was, at this point, 27 years old. He was married with a family, and he was the Emperor Jones. He stood on top of the world. And he went on to play in the U.S. Amateur that summer at Pebble Beach in California. And while he was there, he was expected to run through that field like a hot knife through butter. And instead, he was defeated in the first round, which turned out to be one of the greatest things that's ever happened to the history of golf. Because on one of the days when he wasn't playing, since he lost in the first round, he had the opportunity to go play Cypress Point, which is right next door to Pebble Beach. Cypress Point had been designed by Alister Mackenzie. My grandfather had always loved Mackenzie's work, and when he saw Cypress Point, he became convinced that at some point in the future, Mackenzie was going to work with him to design what my grandfather considered to be the perfect golf course, which later became the Augusta National Golf Club. Had he not lost in the first round of the U.S. Amateur, why, that might not have happened, which just goes to show there may be something to destiny after all. So he lost in that tournament. The next spring, he went over to St. Andrews to play in the British Amateur. And that was when he first noticed something wasn't quite right. He woke up after a practice round, woke up the next morning, and he noticed that he had a crick in his neck, where he just didn't feel real comfortable with it. And he ascribed that to simply sleeping with the window open. Sleeping with the window open. And he went on and he played the tournament and he won the British Amateur. It was the only British Amateur he ever won. He then went on to Hoylake to win the British Open. And when he came back to the United States, he was greeted in New York with his second ticker tape parade. Do you know that he is the only athlete in the history of the United States to receive 2 ticker tape parades in New York City? Jimmy Walker, the unbelievably corrupt mayor of New York at the time, although I think that too is probably redundant, but at any rate, Jimmy Walker, who was the mayor of New York at the time, said that it was that fate could never have foreseen what would be done by bringing these 2 men together, namely that the world's greatest golfer should be introduced by the world's worst golfer. My grandfather went on later to win the United States Open in Interlaken. And this was another thing that was in his favor. People always talked about his sense of humor, and he definitely had a sense of humor. But it always served a purpose. When he got to Interlaken, he was told by one of his fellow competitors, they said, "Bob, do you know it's going to be 105 degrees in the shade?" My grandfather just brushed it off. He goes, "Well, it's a good thing we don't have to play in the shade, isn't it?" Now think about that. Think about that for a minute. Think about that for just a minute. What he's basically saying is this: we all have to play in the same conditions. We all have to do it. And in fact, there are a couple of people that were struck by lightning in that tournament as well. In Minneapolis, surprisingly, you think of Minnesota as being this wonderfully temperate area, and I think when they had a tournament at Hazeltine a few years back, 2 people were killed by lightning in the middle of a PGA championship. So some wild weather can happen there. By the time he won at Interlaken, it was pretty clear what his intention was. Now, I'm often asked, when did your grandfather first decide that he might be able to win the Grand Slam? I will tell you. He decided it in 1926. And the reason why was in 1926, it was the first time that anyone had ever won the double, which was the US and British Opens in the same year. And when he did that, he thought, you know, if I can do that, I can capture the other two, and I could win all four in the same year. So he looked at the calendar and saw where were the tournaments going to be played over the next few years to see where he had the best chance of doing the Grand Slam. And he realized it would be in 1930. He also knew that would be good because the Walker Cup would be in Scotland that year, and so he wouldn't have to pay for transportation overseas, which was no small task in the late 20s, right after the Depression. So when he went over, now here's the thing. Do you know how many people he told about his goal to win the Grand Slam? Nobody. He didn't tell O.B. Keeler. He didn't tell his father. He didn't even tell his wife. And he told my grandmother, he and my grandmother were, they had no secrets from each other. But he kept that one. And I'll tell you why he did. His mother was absolutely adamant that you make plans for your life. You make detailed and as specific plans on your life as you possibly can, and you don't tell anybody. Because in an indelicate way, she would have probably said, somebody is always willing to pee on your parade. Okay? So he told nobody. But by the time he won the Open at Interlaken, and there was one tournament left to win, there was no doubt what was the agenda. There was no doubt that his goal was to win all four national championships in the same year. Now, nowadays, our major championship season is pretty quick. It starts in April with the Masters, and it ends in August with the PGA, and it just goes, you know, Masters, US Open, British Open, PGA, done. Not so back then. The US Open Championship, which back then was the third leg of the Grand Slam, was in July. The US Amateur, the fourth leg of the Grand Slam, was held in September. So and late September. So that meant he had almost 3 months where he had to endure everybody in the press, people writing articles about could he do it or couldn't he do it. He had to endure people constantly coming up to him and asking him questions, and he had to endure one other thing that just disturbed him terribly. He had to endure the fact that people were betting large sums of money on him to win. And that really bothered him. He found out a friend of his had bet $50,000 on my grandfather that he would win the US Amateur. Now this is, remember, 1930, right after the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression in 1929. So he went up to Marion, and while he was at Marion, he played his final US Amateur. Now, interestingly enough, Marion was also the place where he had played his first US Amateur. One of the things, because my grandfather was an engineer, is he loved symmetry. He loved things to be in balance. And he always thought it was really cool that his first tournament and his last tournament were both held at Marion. He went through the field. He qualified very lackluster. He qualified very safely, but he just never felt like his game was really on. But once he got into the tournament itself, he just ripped the field apart. He finally played his final match against Gene Homans and defeated him 8 holes up with 7 holes to play. It would have ended sooner, but on the 10th hole, both he and Homans double bogeyed the 10th hole. Now, there are no easy holes at Marion, but if there is one, it's number 10. It's a pretty straightforward, pretty simple hole. They both made double bogey 6, and on the official scorecard, my grandfather circled the hole and wrote above it, "Ha ha," and then signed his name to the card. he finally closed it out on the 11th hole. Now, the 11th hole at Marion is a downhill par 4. It goes almost straight down the hill. It's fair. Back then, it probably played about 340 yards. And there's a little brook called Babbling Brook that runs in front of the green. Now, the green on the 11th hole is maybe a third the size of this room. It's absolutely tiny. And there is a shot of him hitting his final full shot into that 11th hole at Marion. And one of the things that you see when you look back up is a sea of human beings behind him. There were over 15,000 people that came out to watch him play that final round at Marion. They actually did one of the first remote radio broadcasts of that tournament. Grantland Rice announced it, but here's what they mean by remote. This is no joke. This is what I'm wearing today. See right here, this little wireless thing? What Grantland Rice had was, no kidding, he had a cable that was like 1.5 miles long. And they had 3 people whose job was to keep the cable going so that, because you couldn't outrun your microphone, and they didn't have wireless stuff back then. But that's how the news got out to the entire world. Now, one of the things that was different for my grandfather was that this. Nowadays, people like Tiger Woods, they live in such a bubble like you wouldn't believe. In my grandfather's day, everybody knew who he was, but they didn't know who he was. I'll give you an example. When he had that second ticker tape parade in 1930, he went outside the Waldorf Astoria that night to smoke a cigarette. He's standing outside smoking a cigarette. Their street sweepers are sweeping up all the ticker tape, and this New York cop is standing right there. And my grandfather turns to him and he says, "So, officer, what's all the fuss about?" And the cop just looked over and said, "Oh, it's just a parade for some damn golfer." He loved to tell that story on himself. But it tells us something. Now, if you had said to that cop, "Do you know who Bobby Jones is?" He would have said, "Absolutely, I know who Bobby Jones is. He's a great golfer." Would he have been able to pick him out of a lineup? No, not in the slightest. Not absolutely in the slightest. So he wins the Grand Slam, and then he does something that's unthinkable. He retires. By this time, he's already a lawyer. He does not want to play the professional game for several reasons. One is there was no money in it. There was absolutely no money in it. Number 2 was he did not want to make his living by playing a game. The third thing was he had a wife and he had 3 kids, or 2 and 1 on the way at that point. And he wanted to be able to have time with his family. And there were other things that he wanted to do as well. He wanted to start giving back to the game. He did want to make some money, but he wanted to give back to the game. And so what he did was he made a series of instructional videos for Warner Brothers that are still considered pretty state-of-the-art even today. He developed Augusta National. He wrote column after column that were later put into books. And his life was about as perfect as it could possibly be, except for the fact that he was starting to have little bits of tingling on the very tips of his fingers and on the very tips of his toes. And he didn't really think much about it. But then later he would be walking along and all of a sudden he'd catch his right foot because his foot was starting to turn inward from atrophy. He finally, by the time he was in his mid-40s, he came here to Emory and had an exploratory surgery because they felt that maybe there was a strained disc and they could remove it and relieve some of the pressure in his spine, but nothing got any better. After many years, by 1948, he went to Columbia University in New York City and he met with a neurologist there named Houston Merritt. And Houston Merritt was the leading neurologist in the world, put him through a whole series of tests, and finally he came to him and he said, "Bob," he said, you have a disease called syringomyelia." And my grandfather at first was very relieved to know what was wrong with him. But then he found out the bad news. There was nothing that could be done for it. It was going to get worse, and it was never going to get better, and it would eventually take his life. He was diagnosed with that in 1948. Most people die from syringomyelia within just a few years when they get it from trauma. He died in 1971, by the way, when he was talking with Al Laney, who was the chief writer of the New York Herald Tribune. Al said to him, "Bob, what is the prognosis?" He said, "Well, Al, I'm going to be very honest with you. It's not going to get any better. It's going to get worse, and it's going to eventually kill me. But you know, Al, in golf, we play the ball as it lies, and now we're never going to talk about this again." And he never did. And he never did. During the time I knew him, I was born in 1957. By the time I knew him, he was already on a walker. By the time I was 5 years old, he was in a wheelchair. And yet during that whole time, I never heard him complain. I never heard him reminisce either. He would never want to talk about the good old days. In fact, Charlie Price, the golf writer for many years for Golf Magazine, told the story of being with my grandfather when he was with a couple of old U.S. Open champions, and they were talking about the good old days, and finally my grandfather said, "Well, boys, you're just going to have to excuse me now. Charlie and I have got some business we need to discuss." And so they were shuffled off out of his presence, and my grandfather sat there sipping on his martini, and Charlie just sat in silence, and finally said, "Well, Bob, what did you want to talk about?" He said, "Oh, nothing, Charlie. I just didn't want to sit around and listen to that crap." Remember what I told you before about how he learned to play competitive golf? That he learned to stay focused in the moment and never be concerned about what had gone on before or worried about what was going to come afterwards? That was the same thing that he brought to dealing with this horrible, horrible illness. Most people with illness like that would be so prone to self-pity, and yet he never was. People who would come to visit him would frequently say that when they left, that, wow, you know, they just felt so elevated just having talked to the man because he was so positive, and he was. And he would not look backwards. He would not talk about the great events that he had done in the past. And in fact, he was so focused on just stuff that when it came time for him to donate his medals, Cliff Roberts had always wanted him to give his medals to the Augusta National Golf Club. Well, they didn't have a 501c3 to receive them, so he gave them to the United States Golf Association at Golf House so he could get a tax deduction. That was his reason for doing it. He wanted a tax deduction. Now, that's pretty cold when you think about it. I mean, if you had won 21 United States golf medals, you'd probably be a little more emotionally attached to them than he was. But he wasn't, except for that one little cup. His life finally deteriorated to the point he ceased attending the Masters in 1969. There was a lot that was made of that, and I'm going to save that for another time. But that was the last time that he attended the Masters, and the last time he ever went to Augusta National. His life, which had been at one point standing on top of the world, where he was called the Emperor Jones, by 1970 he had been reduced to a 75-pound man who was virtually bedridden, who entertained family and extraordinarily close friends, and that was about it, whose life was lived in an apartment at the corner of Peachtree Road and Andrews Drive. Gone was the great mansion of Whitehall because he couldn't negotiate that anymore, and it was no longer safe after a fire broke out in the house. And had my father not been there, would have taken probably both my grandmother and my grandfather's life. So he was into this apartment, and yet he never became negative, never turned negative. 2 weeks before he died, he had an aortal aneurysm rupture. It was a pinpoint leak, and he very slowly started to bleed to death. Later that week, he invited the pastor of Cathedral of Christ the King to his bedside, where he was baptized and received his first communion. And he said to that event, he said, "If I had known how happy this would have made my wife, I would have done it years ago." But spirituality and faith for him was something that was very real. And even though he took the action to make my grandmother happy, he was always a man that looked towards the larger kinds of questions. A week later, my father and my two aunts were gathered by his bedside. By this time, he was down to, his death certificate said he weighed 68 pounds. And taking their hands in his hands, he turned to them and he said, "If this is what it's like to die, it's beautiful." And the day later, he closed his eyes. The next morning, 7:30 a.m. Atlanta time, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon over in Scotland, the flag over the Royal and Ancient Clubhouse went to half-mast. Everybody playing on the golf course saw it, and they knew what it meant. And every golfer on all the St. Andrews courses immediately picked up their bags and walked in because Bobby Jones was gone. And yet, even though he is gone, his legacy continues to live. It lives in the sportsmanship of the game, in the highest award that the United States Golf Association gives every year, the Bob Jones Award. It lives every year in April, when the Masters is played. It lives in the lives of 4 young people seated right here who are Bobby Jones scholars. It lives in a Bobby Jones scholar all the way on the back row back there. The legacy of Bobby Jones grows more over time. How many people whose birthday was in 1902 would we still be talking about in 2015? The greatest man that I have ever known personally, and the more that I have studied him, the greatest man that I think I ever could know, was my grandfather. It's my privilege to have known him, and it's my privilege to have shared his story with you tonight. Thank you. I'll take a few questions. I just got 10,000 steps. 10,000.
Can you take a couple more and
I can do a couple more.
Answer some more questions?
Yeah, if anybody has any
questions? If no questions, I'll ask questions. All right, good.
Oh, we got one.
Do you have any stories about the Peachtree Golf Club?
Yeah, you know, it's a funny thing about how that got started because the story is, and I'm not sure how apocryphal this is or not, but the story is that my grandfather had always had his eye on the Ashford plantation at the corner of Ashford, Dunwoody, and Peachtree Road. Of course, again, just like Eastlake, you know, that was considered to be way out in the middle of nowhere at the time. My grandmother thought it was just insane to build a golf course halfway to Chattanooga. And at any rate, but apparently Robert Woodruff had had a difficult time getting a tee time at the athletic club, and he called up my grandfather and said, "Are you still interested in developing the Ashford plantation?" And so they had a organizational meeting at the old C&S Bank building on Marietta Street in the boardroom on the second floor. Mills Lane was there, and he actually gave my grandfather the head seat at the table. And Robert Trent Jones, who was the architect that was involved, was seated to my grandfather's left. Now, Robert Trent Jones at the time went by Bob Jones. And my grandfather had assembled all the business leaders of Atlanta surrounding him, one of whom was my maternal grandfather, Roy Hardy Massey, who ran Massey Fair, which was a food distributorship back then. And the story is that my grandfather said, "Gentlemen, you are the charter members of Peachtree Golf Club, and before you leave here today, I'd like a check from each of you for $5,000. To which everybody reached in their pocket and pulled out their checkbook and wrote a check for $5,000. Trent Jones said, when he saw that, he said he had never fully understood what power was until he saw that moment. And he said to my grandfather, he said, "You know what? There can be only one Bob Jones, and from now on, I'm Trent." And they designed the golf course together. It is probably, you know, I know this is a very controversial statement that I'm going to make, but I think in some ways, Augusta National is iconic for what it is. But if you really want to see what my grandfather's thinking was as it matured, because remember Peachtree was, 15 years after Augusta National? You really need to see Peachtree Golf Club. It is probably, well, I think it's the finest golf course in Atlanta, and probably one of the finest in the Southeast. Of course, that's not really a rocket science statement, is it? But that's what I remember. I do know one other thing about Peachtree. That was the site of the most painful golf lesson that had ever been given in the world. And I'll tell you what it was. My dad decided he wanted to take up golf. My grandfather said, there's no way that I want my son to play golf. The pressure of being Bobby Jones III is just too much. So he arranged for my dad to have a lesson with Stuart Maiden out at Peachtree, which was not fully completed at that point, but the range was open. And so he said, you meet Stuart at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you're going to get your lesson. So Dad got out there. There's just this big thing of golf balls. Stuart is sitting at a table underneath an umbrella, and there's this big bucket of something right to Stuart's left. My dad starts hitting balls. He's hitting balls all the way to 12 noon. Finally, at 12 noon, he puts down his club. He starts heading in. Stuart looks at him. He says, where are you going? My father said, well, I'm going to get some lunch. Stuart said, I don't take lunch. Come back here and keep hitting. About 2 o'clock, my father's hands started bleeding because he just hit them raw. And he turned to Stuart and he showed him his hands because he figured this would be a way to maybe get out of hitting balls. And Stuart said, stick them in the bucket. And he stuck them in the bucket, and it was a bucket full of brine. And he said, now what do you want me to do, Stuart? He said, keep hitting. Well, it didn't really discourage my dad because 2 years later, my father won the city amateur. And he eventually ended up with a +2 handicap, played in 3 national amateurs, and was a very fine regional player up in Massachusetts. But that great lesson took place at Peachtree. So there's a couple of Peachtree stories.
Got one more question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
How did he survive, the family survive the Depression?
Well, you know, the family survived the Depression actually reasonably well. The South took it pretty hard, but it was not hit quite as economically hard as the North was. Also, my grandfather was in the practice of law. I mean, they did take something of a downturn, but the law firm did fairly well. Also, up in Canton, Robert Tyre Jones, who ran the Canton textile mills, when the Depression hit and they knew that, you know, the demand for denim was going to drop dramatically, they went to Robert T. Jones and they said, Mr. RT, how many people are you going to let go? He said, I'm not letting anybody go. We're going to stay at full production through this thing. He said, these people made this company with me, and we're either going to make it together or we're going to go down together. And he said, denim never goes bad. We'll always find a market for it. And they did, actually, later. Of course, it was called World War II, but, you know.